Hey, great. Thank you, Jay. Appreciate it. Glad that you're with us this evening. Hope you've had a fantastic day. What a beautiful day it was. The sunshine was tremendous. Able to get out a little bit at lunch, go grab a bite, quick bite with my wife. What a great day and great event that was. Appreciate uh, the beauty of today. Appreciate God's blessings of it. Hope you are taking advantage of our first River Road day of prayer. Be looking for other days as the year progresses. Be listening for those as well. If you have your Bibles with you in our Bible study tonight, we're still studying the book of Mark. You might want to turn to Mark chapter 12, beginning in verse 35. While you're progressing to that point, let me give you a little story, a little funny. We always try to begin with somewhat, at least a cute note. It may not always be just a laugher, but just a cute note. Stories told of two men that were fishing underneath a bridge one day. And as they were fishing, one looked up and he noticed that a funeral procession was passing over the bridge. And so he laid his rod and reel down. He took his cap off. He bowed his head, and the procession passed over the bridge. And when it was finished, then he put his cap back on his head. He picked up his fishing pole and he threw his line back out into the water again. And the other individual said, well, that was just touching. I just didn't think you had that in you. And the first guy responded, well, I guess that was the least thing I could do for her since I had been married to her for 40 years. Well, like I say, not a big hee-haw, but that's a kind of a cute one to think about, needless to say. In Mark chapter 12, where we are this evening, beginning in verse 35, we're still in the last week of the life of Christ, and we're still on Tuesday. It's taken us a couple of weeks to get through the 12th chapter. There's a lot in it. There's a lot, as we'll see, in the 13th chapter, beginning when we began it. But in this 12th chapter, we have the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Herodians all ganging up on Jesus, taking their turns, seeing what they can do in order to entrap him, in order to show that he is a fake, a fraud, that he is someone that cannot be trusted. And yet Jesus stands his ground every time, answers every question just magnificently, and consequently those that ask the questions are stumped. Last week we noticed that the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Herodians they'd gotten their fill. They didn't know anything to do. They didn't know anything to ask of Jesus. And there was one scribe that came to Jesus, a Pharisee would have been his background, and asked Jesus what was the great commandment. And Jesus so answered that. You see, he thought he had Jesus, but Jesus answered it. As he told him, is to love God, and the second is like unto it, you're to love your neighbor. Well, he was answered. But then beginning in verse 35, it seems as if this scribe was still there in the presence of Jesus. And notice that it says, then Jesus answered and said while he taught in the temple, how is it that the scribes say that the Christ is the son of David? For David himself said by the Holy Spirit, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. Therefore, David himself calls him Lord. How is it he then is his son? And the common people heard him gladly. It's a question. And the basic question is this from Jesus. David, who these Jews would have thought the world of, David called Jesus Lord. And if David called Jesus Lord, why did he do so? He only did so because Jesus was God in the flesh. Jesus was the Messiah. He was the Son of God. He was God. And being God in the flesh, excuse me, ultimately Jesus had established for all of those that were there, and especially this scribe, trying to figure out who Jesus was. Jesus says, now, if David calls Jesus Lord, then who are you? Well, there's no other answer that can be given other than Jesus is Lord. Well, how important was that? Well, think about it. To be wrong about Jesus would have been to be wrong about your salvation. The Jew that denied Jesus was wrong about his salvation. The individual that turned his back upon Jesus and said Jesus is not the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, then is claiming that their salvation comes from somewhere or someone else. And so to be wrong about Jesus would be wrong about your salvation. But Jesus really wants to know, well, who is this Messiah? Well, he's the Son of God. He's the Master. David, by inspiration, made this call. This was not just, if you will, this was not just David off the hem of the cuff talking and saying, well, this is Lord of my Lord. No. David, by inspiration, made this statement. Psalm 110 in verse 1 is actually the psalm that is quoted here. And so Jesus really asked a question in making a statement. And the question that he's asking this scribe is Jesus the Lord of your life? And is he not only the Lord of your life, but is he the Lord in your life? Is he your master? Now, that question has all sorts of little tentacles of importance and ramifications, doesn't it? To say that Jesus is Lord of your life means that he is the master of your life. He dictates, he decides your will, not you. Oh, wait a minute, preacher, it's my will. And thus I get to dictate it. That's right. But when you make Jesus the Lord of your life, then that very fact, that very belief, that very idea then says, okay, Jesus is the Lord of my life. It's not my will, but his will. It's not what I want, but what he wants. And so it is a heart, a mind, a will of submission. And so Jesus is trying to point this out. Look here. If David made Jesus the Son of God, then shouldn't he be the Lord of your life? And the answer is yes. And the common people heard him and glorified him. In other words, they understood what he was saying. And the folks that had been wanting, and the folks that had been following him now are understanding and saying, boy, we chose the right one. We got the right one for the job. As the text goes on then, Jesus says that we're to beware of scribes. Then he said to them in his teaching, beware of the scribes who desire to go around in long robes, love greetings in the marketplaces, the best seats in the synagogues, and the best places at the feast, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation. You see, remember, as we said, the context was the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Herodians, the scribe, they had all been there asking questions, and evidently they're still there. And if it's not, say, per se them, there is a crowd there. And Jesus tells everyone that's there, you need to be careful. You need to be careful of the scribes. And think about it. The scribes were learned men of Jesus' day. They were responsible for writing the law. They were also responsible for interpreting the law. Now, writing the law, I just simply mean they copied it. The law was already written, but they would because there were not photocopy machines, as we know. Xerox had not come around, if you will. And so what happened is that men would sit and read the law and write it then and make a copy of it. That's the copy. That was the Xerox copy of the day, was hand done. That's one of the things that the scribes did, but they also interpreted the law. And so they were seen sort of, if you will, as keepers of the law and teachers of the law. And Jesus says you got to beware of certain ones of them. You got to be careful. You got to be careful that their hypocrisy does not come through and shine through. There were certain ones, evidently, of the scribes who allowed their ambition for position to affect them and to affect the way they acted and really the way they thought of themselves. They were the ones that had become self-centered. They were the ones that were, if you will, certain ones of them, not all of the scribes, but certain ones of them were the narcissists of the day. In other words, I'm number one. I'm most important. And so Jesus says there are certain of the scribes that they love the long robes. They love the pretense of being seen. They love the greetings in the marketplaces. Now, it was very common for a friend, if you will, to greet a friend in biblical times if they saw them in the marketplace. And sometimes it was the full formal greeting of grace, mercy, and peace be unto you. And sometimes it was a less formal, as we would put it in our day and age, hey, how you doing? But Jesus said there were those that loved greetings in the marketplaces. These were long, ostentatious greetings that brought, if you will, recognition from others. As they would look, they would say, "Ooh, they must be important. Listen to them talk." And then he says, verse 39, they love the best seats in the synagogues. Now, there wasn't a lot of places to go, but if there were 10 Jews in a city, a synagogue would be built. And a synagogue really was just one room. And usually in the center of the room, and sometimes at the front of the room, there would be a raised platform, not very high, mind you, but a raised platform. And there the speaker would sit. And the chief seats or best seats in the synagogues were those where they would sit up front, so to speak. We might say they were sitting at the head table. They were sitting to be seen. And the best places in the feast, they want to be seen. They're out hobnobbing, if you will, amongst the people, not because of their position, but because they want a position. These individuals are even cruel, Jesus says in verse 40, for they devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They're not only cruel, they're hypocritical. Notice what he says, for a pretense. They make long prayers. Prayer is to come from the heart. Prayer can be pretentious. It can be in order to be seen. Jesus, if you remember, reminds folks in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6 that when you pray, do not pray as the hypocrites are, for they pray to be seen of men. But verily I say unto you, that when you pray, enter into your closet, and when you have shut your door, pray to your Father which is in secret. And your Father which sees in secret will reward you openly. Matthew chapter 6. There were those, though, that made their prayers loud and long. And if you make your prayers loud and long, what happens? Well, people talk about you, right? And so Jesus says, that these folks, these scribes, that are really nothing more than hypocrites, that you need to be careful of them. Live your profession is one way of putting the application. It's the way I put it in my notes. Live your profession. In other words, don't just profess to be a Christian. Live your profession. Live what you said. If you say, well, I'm a Christian, then live like it. Act like it. Practice like it. These scribes did not, oh, we're the teachers of the law, we're the interpreters of the law, but what you're doing is, one, to be seen of men. Number two, it's pretentious. Number three, it is hypocritical. And number four, you even practice things that are cruel. You do not practice the things of God. Notice then that Jesus makes a statement. These will receive greater condemnation, both here and now and in the world to come. The teacher has the greater responsibility, doesn't he? The teacher has the responsibility of teaching what is right, teaching not just what is acceptable. There was a famous preacher once, and I'll not call his name, but when asked about a particular doctrine, said that he believed that the Bible taught one way, but he taught it another. And someone asked him, well, why didn't he change? And he said, well, I'll lose my following if I do. And so he was not concerned about really this people's souls, but he was concerned about folks following him. We need to be concerned about what the Word of God says. Thus, we're concerned about people's souls, and that's what Jesus is saying. Be sure that your teachers, be sure that your religious leaders are folks that really care about your soul. Those folks that are fake, they'll receive a greater condemnation. Is that possible? Hebrews chapter 10, verse 29 would seem to say that it is. And so we see the Lord's admonition, be careful of others. Now, Jesus, verse 41, sat opposite the treasury and saw how the people put money into the treasury. And many who were rich put in much. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which were a quadrant. So he called his disciples to himself and said to them, assuredly I say to you, that this poor widow has put in more than all those who have given to the treasury. For they all put in out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had, her whole livelihood. This is a great lesson. If the first lesson is on get your teacher right, be sure it's Jesus, follow Jesus, don't be hypocritical, live your profession. This third one is all about giving everything you can to the Lord. But let's look at it and let's see if it's the idea of just give everything to the Lord and have nothing. Jesus was sitting opposite of the treasury. Now you have to understand, he's in the temple. The temple is fairly large. It's like 990 feet by 1,100 feet by 910 feet by 1,000 feet. It's fairly large. There are in the outer court, the court of the Gentiles, it is called, there are 13 places for an individual to bring their contribution and put it. Now, we have for years, and I'm going to jump off here for just a minute. We have passed the collection plate. Now, because of the pandemic and being quarantined, we've talked about and have asked folks to send their contribution in. You can send it in mail, or you can bring it by the church building. We have, when we were meeting, and I'm sure we will probably continue this when we go back to meeting in public, whenever, or together, whenever that is, that we will have a box out in the foyer, and you can put your contribution in that box. There's nothing wrong with that. The Lord tells us to take our collection upon the first day of the week and to give as we've been prospering. He doesn't tell us how to take it up. I've seen it done by the taking of trays. I've seen it done by baskets. And the Lord doesn't tell us. A lot of congregations now are practicing giving online. Folks just set up almost an automatic bank draft, and it just comes out every week of their account and goes into the church's account. There are several different ways of doing it, but in the first century there were places. Let's go back to the text now. I'll get off my soapbox. There are 13 places around in the court of the Gentiles, or really the place that was pretty much open to all, that they could come, and what they looked like, the actual, if you will, basket they looked like a trumpet, or maybe even in a more simplistic way of our way of thinking, a bugle. Because when we think of a trumpet, we often think of a valved instrument, but the bugle, sort of a simple curvature of metal, that was inverted, and the bell, or the big piece where the notes, the music comes out of, that would be sitting up, and people could drop their money into that basket, if you will. Now, Jesus tells about there, as he's watching the treasury, he's watching folks put in money, and he says many that were rich were putting in a great deal, but there's one lady. And verse 42 calls her a poor lady. Now, how poor is poor? Well, poor, I'm poor and everybody else is rich, and maybe sitting on a lot of money, maybe sitting on very little. Poor may seem to be relative, but evidently this is a lady that has none. Think about what it says. Poor widow. A woman was dependent upon her husband to make the livelihood for the family. And if she had male children, of course, then they were, once her husband died, they were responsible to take care of the family, and to take care of the family financially. There were no social programs in New Testament times. And so she truly leaned upon her husband. She truly leaned then upon her children. And she leaned then upon, if you will, the goodness and kindness of others. This lady evidently has virtually nothing. She's a poor widow. And she comes to the treasury and she throws in 2 mites. Now, a mite is the smallest coin in size and in value in New Testament times. The value is exactly, it's a little bit hard to explain. We could say, well, it's like our penny. Our 1 penny is 1/100th of a dollar. Well, a mite, 2 mites would make up a quadrant. And a quadrant, then you'd have to have several in order to make up a denarius. But a denarius was a day's wage. 2 mites, somewhere around 1/120th. Remember, now that's a fraction, 1 over 120. In other words, take 120 of these to make a denarius, to make a day's wages. So she puts in, from a monetary standpoint, virtually nothing. But Jesus commends this lady, because notice when she puts that in, he called his disciples together, and he says, this poor widow has put in more than all of those. that have given much to the treasury. She's put in all more than those who have given to the treasury. Now, let's commend her for giving. Some folks quit giving when they don't have much because they say, I don't have much. And so, what I have is what I have, and it's all I have, and I have to meet my bills. This lady, even though she didn't have much, is willing to contribute it. And not only that, but Jesus says she's put in everything. She's put in her whole livelihood. She's put in all that she had. You see, the rich and everybody else, they were just putting in, oh, I got a little extra. But she, out of her own poverty, put in her whole livelihood. In other words, when she put it in, when she went home, she probably thought, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't have anything else. It reminds us a lot, or it reminds me a lot of the story of Elijah. Remember the lady, and he asked for something to eat, and she says, basically, I don't have anything, and what little I've got, I'm going to go make my son a cake. I'm going to go make me a cake, and we're going to eat it, and then we're basically going to die. Remember that story? Well, that reminds me a lot of this. Jesus, though, commends this woman. It's not, if you will, it's not the portion that one puts in, but it's the proportion that's important. Now, think about what I just said. It's not the portion. It's not the fact that she put in 2 mites. It's not the fact that she put in virtually the least amount she could put in. But it is the fact that she gave all that she could give. That's the point for all of us to understand. How much do you give to the Lord? You can say, well, preacher, now, when you start talking about giving, you're meddling. You're talking about something that's personal. I understand that. And this little section here is really not so much about giving money and how much you give upon the first day of the week. Let me encourage you to consult 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and see that we're to give grudgingly or give cheerfully, not grudgingly or of necessity. God loves a cheerful giver. That we're to give because we've been given, and so thus we're to give back. And so it is our responsibility to give. The proportion of that we're to give is as we've been prospered. And the portion that we give is established based upon as we've been prospered. And so we give, but we give from the heart. And we give ourselves. So much so that in giving ourselves, we're following the Lord. Lord, here I am. Take me and use me. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, remember, they were basically poor folks. And Paul said, this they did not as we hoped, but they first gave themselves to the Lord. Paul said, before they ever put the first, if you will, dollar in the collection plate, they gave themselves. And then what happened is everything took care of itself. What's that? Well, that means that they gave as they had prospered, and not only gave as they had prospered, but then God blessed them and their needs were met. That's the way God works. The principle that Jesus is teaching here is to give yourself to the Lord, but give all of yourself to the Lord. For he is who? Well, remember, as we started out tonight, he's the Lord. He's the master. And so as Jesus winds out, and this would be, while Mark did not write in chapters and in verses, while Mark did not write that way, he just wrote at kind of a flowing narrative. The idea breaks here, and this is a good place for us to stop for the evening. But the principles of the three little paragraphs that we looked at tonight, that first of all, make Jesus the Lord of your life. Make sure that he is the master of your will, not you, but he is the master of your life. Be sure that you live the profession of your faith. Don't just say, well, I'm a Christian. Live that. Live the way you're supposed to live. Live the way you're saying that you are going to live. And then thirdly, give all of yourself to the Lord. And as you give all of yourself to the Lord, everything will come in place. Now, having said all of that, look quickly in Mark 13. I just want to establish something, and I want you to do something for me, if you will. In Mark chapter 13, Jesus is out of the temple. He's outside of the temple, and his disciples began to ask him with regards to the temple and with regards to things that are going to happen. I want you to notice a couple of things. Kind of get this in your thinking for next week. Notice in verse 4 that there's basically two questions going to be asked. Matthew makes it a little clearer. So while we don't refer, we're trying to stick with Mark in our study, I want you to go read Matthew 24 and Matthew 25 and realize that especially beginning in verse 3 and 4 of Matthew 24, that there are two questions that are asked. Now that will help you in understanding what we're going to talk about next week in Mark 13. Dear friend, we thank you for listening. We hope that you have a great rest of the week, that God blesses you and that you bless others with your life. We look forward to seeing you Sunday, and until then, may God bless you and keep you is my prayer. Have a good day.